Welcome everyone to our Tenant Legislative Advocacy Training. My name is Laura Dobbs, and I'm a housing attorney with the Virginia Poverty Law Center. And joining me today is Christy Mara, our fearless leader, director of housing advocacy at the Poverty Law Center, to go over how the legislative process works, how to follow along with tenants' rights issues at the General Assembly this year, and a brief overview of some of the bills we're going to be advocating for and how you can get involved in advocating for tenants' rights. So just some basic overview, going back to some Civics 101 here. The way the Virginia government works is there's three co-equal branches. There's the legislative branch, where you have the General Assembly that is made up of 100 delegates and 40 senators. They're the ones who write and pass laws. Then you have the executive branch, where you have the governor who's head of the executive that's elected statewide. There's a lieutenant governor, the attorney general who enforces Virginia's laws. And then under the governor, you have various state agencies. For most people, the way they interact with Virginia is through the various state agencies, whether it's you're working with your local social services to get, welfare benefits, or you're going to the DMV to try to get a driver's license. And the third branch is the judicial branch. You have the Virginia Supreme Court, who's a Supreme Court of the state, but there's also lower courts below that people interact with more regularly. And they're the ones who interpret Virginia's rules and decide disputes about what the law means.
And Laura, I want to throw in one thing here that I didn't know until I started working at the Poverty Law Center many years ago, and that is that the governor has his own legislative agenda. So one thing that you may see actually in the housing arena this session is that there may be some bills that will be called governor's bills. The governor can actually introduce bills after the deadline for everybody else. And so I just wanted to point that out in case the governor, he has been, as I understand it, talking a little bit about having some housing legislation. I haven't seen it yet, but that may come up. Okay, sorry, Laura.
No, you're fine. And the way he typically does that, he isn't the bill patron. He'll tell a delegate, hey, you're carrying this bill for me. And Virginia is a little unusual in that outside of the three main branches of government, we also have the State Corporation Commission, which is an independent body that controls things such as utility regulation, regulating financial institutions, and insurance. That's a special owned thing. They have their own administrative courts and writing their own rules and regulations, but that's also largely governed by Virginia statute. And something else to know about Virginia is we are what's called a Dillon rule state. And what that means that even though there's various local governments in Virginia, they only have the power to act as granted them by the state. So let's say this Fairfax wants to pass rent stabilization or rent caps, something to control the price of rent. Well, they can't do that unless the legislature says that they can. And Virginia reads this very narrowly to where governments can only ask unless expressly granted the powers by the Virginia General Assembly, which really limits what they can do. And that's why you often see localities ask their local delegation to carry bills for them to give them the power to carry out their local business. And so how does a bill go from twinkling in our eyes to actually something that passes? Well, legislators will receive concerns from a whole array of people, from lobbyists such as Christy and I, different interest groups, organizations, agencies, and as Christy mentioned, the governor, but also their own constituents who have had concerns that they bring to their delegate. Both the Senate and the House will submit bills for consideration, and those bills will get numbered based on which chamber the bill originates in. So if a senator files a bill, it'll be Senate bill number whatever. Or if it's a House bill, it'll be House bill number, etc. And then each of those bills are sent to a committee based on the issue to be heard. Generally, they're going to divide the bills to committees based on subject matter. So all of our housing and tenant rights bills will generally be sent to the General Laws Committee, which is a very wide umbrella, sort of a catch-all, because it doesn't neatly fit into some of the other committees. And at first, go ahead.
Oh, you were probably going to say the same exact thing I was going to say, which was in the Senate, the clerk of the Senate refers the bills to committee and goes pretty strictly by what Laura's talking about, the subject matter, the part of the Virginia Code that the bill is designed to be added to. But in the House, the Speaker of the House actually assigns the bills to committee. So sometimes, if it's a particularly partisan, hot button issue, and the Speaker and his party or her party wants to make sure that the bill doesn't advance very far, you might see a bill that goes to a committee and think, what on earth does that bill have to do with the subject matter of that committee? And that's why you'll see that in the House, but not really in the Senate.
Exactly. And so those bills go to committee, and that committee has to consider the bill and vote on whether it's going to make it out of committee and get sent to the floor, where the entire body will consider the bill. Now, in the House, some of those committee have subcommittees. And so it'll first get heard in a subcommittee that's with a smaller group of people, divided up by more subject matters, and they can recommend to the full committee whether they think it should be sent all the way to the floor. So in the House General Laws, a lot of these housing related bills will be sent to subcommittee number 2, which is just a smaller subset. So there's a few more steps to getting bills out of a House committee versus a Senate. Sometimes the Senate will have subcommittees if there's a particularly contentious issue or subject matter that needs some special consideration. They might form a special subcommittee. Now, once it makes it out of committee, it then goes to the floor. House bills will go to the House floor, Senate bills going to the Senate floor, and it has to go through 3 different readings. Why we still hold on to this old idea, I don't know. It's still enshrined in the Virginia Constitution, so it has to go through 3 readings before they take a final vote on that 3rd reading. And once a bill passes the House, it goes to the Senate. Bills that pass the Senate then go to the House. And this is where things get really interesting. So once a bill passes one chamber, gets sent to the other chamber, this goes through a process called crossover. And there's a deadline that all bills have to make it out of one chamber before they cross over. Any bills that don't make it out, they're just left on the cutting room floor and are dead. And once it's in that other chamber, the whole process repeats itself. Now, once that bill is in the other chamber, they can decide to make their own amendments to a bill, or they can just, approve the whole bill as it was. But oftentimes they like to mess with other people's stuff and make amendments. And if that happens, they pass a version that doesn't look identical to the one that was sent to them. It gets sent back over to the other chamber for them to consider the amendments, whether they want to reject them. And then it gets sent back over and back and forth, this volleying, until they come up with a final version. If there's too much of this back and forth, they will send the bill to a conference committee, where they take members from the House and some members from the Senate from the committee where the bill was heard, to huddle them into a room for a private meeting that is not open to the public, for them to decide on the final language of the bill. We don't see this happen all too often. It always happens with the budget bill, which I'll get into in a few minutes. But sometimes I think it's happened to some of our bills in the past, Christy. But
Yeah, I mean, it's almost, well, I wouldn't say it's inevitable with as many bills as we're working on this year that one would go to conference. But it's not that uncommon. And sometimes there's a strategy that's used by either the proponent or opponents of a bill to actually get the bill into conference. Normally that strategy is used when the bills are actually pretty close and there's just one or two issues that they just might, maybe they're really technical in nature and they need to wait for the experts to get them information, or they need to have a long, really boring discussion that they know they'll lose other members' attention on. And at that point, they may just say, look, we're going to send it to conference and work it out there. So there are all sorts of reasons to send a bill to conference.
Exactly. Once there's an agreed on final version, and that same exact version is passed both the House and the Senate, it then gets sent to the governor's desk. And he has 7 days during the session to act on a bill. Now, once we've reached the end of session, he gets 30 days because he's going to have a lot on his desk at one time. And he can sign the bill as is, he can recommend changes to the bill, at which point it'll get considered again at crossover, whether the legislature wants to approve those changes, or he can veto the bill. And if he vetoes it, again, during crossover, if the legislature wants to override his veto, it has to pass with a 3/4 majority, which is obviously difficult to do.
I think it's a 2/3 majority.
Sorry, 2/3.
And it's, I think are you talking about the reconvene session? Not, yes. You keep saying crossover. But the reconvene. That's what I meant. Right. So the bill gets to the governor. It's already gone through both chambers. If the governor amends it, then the members have a chance to reject or accept the amendments during what's called the reconvene session, or colloquially the veto session, which is held 45 days after the last day of session. We have definitely had bills that the governor has vetoed. And last year, this is just an example of how sometimes a change is worse than nothing at all. One of our bills was amended by the governor, and it made the law worse than if the bill didn't pass at all. And our patrons clearly understood that and asked the legislature, when the bill came back at the reconvene session with these changes, to reject the governor's amendments and let everyone know the governor was going to veto the bill. In that case, the people in the same party as the patrons, they went ahead and voted against the amendments because it's what the patrons asked them to do. And the people in the same party as the governor went ahead and rejected the amendments because they figured, well, governor's going to veto it anyway, so he'll be fine with this. So also, again, all sorts of things happen during the reconvene session.
Yes. And if the governor doesn't make an amendment or veto the bill, does nothing, then after the 30 days, it automatically becomes law. So if it's a bill he just ignores, it doesn't mean it fails. It just, becomes law without him taking any action in the bill. So that's how most things work. Then there's the budget. And the only reason I'm going into a little bit of detail about how the budget bill works is because a lot of the housing related initiatives this year are in the form of a budget amendment. So this is a special bill. We have a biennial budget in Virginia, meaning that, there's a budget that operates over a 2-year period. So starting in September, you have various state agencies that will put together their budget request of what they need to fund their state agency, i.e. to make Virginia's government work. And then in November, the governor is going to review those requests, as well as look at, what streams of income does Virginia have, what revenues are going out, and make adjustments based on that.
And then, Laura, I do want to just interject here, because this is the way it happened this year. Oftentimes we have governors who want to start this process earlier. So it really depends on the administration. I've seen administrations who wanted the agency heads to get their requests in by the end of July. I think one year by the end of June. So it can be earlier than September. That's a little bit on the late side.
Yes. Yeah. And then generally by December, you have the head of the money committees, and these are the committees in both the House and the Senate that hear the budget. And there'll be a member of each committee that files the governor's proposed budget bill. Then that bill gets referred to those money committees. So it is carried by, a delegate and a senator, gets sent to committee just like any other bill. But then legislators have the opportunity to submit their own budget amendments, which are due this Friday. So this is how some of our policies are coming in this year, as we are having legislators submit budget amendments that affect Virginia's purse strings in various ways that we hope will help with housing affordability, housing stability, and other major issues affecting tenants. And then each of those committee go through a pretty lengthy process of going through those budget amendments, and the version that they come out with will look completely different than what the governor proposed. And come February 5th, which is known as Budget Sunday, both the Senate and House Money Committees produce separate budget proposals of all the things that they think Virginia should be spending money on. And they will look drastically different from each other, which means that February through March, after each bill passes its respective chamber, there'll be a lot of that horse trading that we talked about, where the Senate budget will get sent over to the House and the House budget will get sent over to the Senate. They'll be drastically different. They'll reject each other's bills and then get sent to these conference committees, which they typically divide up by different subject area. And that's when the real negotiations about the budget get underway. I don't know if you want to say anything about that in particular, Christy.
The budget process is not the most transparent thing, as Laura has explained. Technically, it's important to get your budget amendment into at least one budget, the House or the Senate, and have a champion in that chamber who will fight for your budget amendment to get into the final budget, which is why we like to, even if we don't have a patron who ends up being a budget conferee, we like to make sure that we have at least one person, like for example, with housing issues in the Senate. George Barker has for a number of years now really taken the lead on those negotiations. So it's important for us to at least try to get Senator Barker, who will be co-chair of the Finance Committee in the Senate this year, to support our budget amendments. But even then, there can be other voices that are louder than his in the Senate among the Senate conferees. But it tends to be very hard to get time with the budget conferees once we get closer and closer to Budget Sunday. They tend to go to some, make-believe corner with a special magic door so nobody can find them, and try to work out all of the differences between the House and the Senate budget. So it's something it's just really hard to be able to predict. I would say the one thing I think you can predict is if a budget amendment or an item in the governor's budget is in both the House and the Senate budget when they come out on Budget Sunday, they're not going to even think about that item again. So I would say 99% of the time, if the item is in both budgets on Budget Sunday, it's done, it's good, we can all breathe easy. But that doesn't usually happen to our things. We usually get in one or the other.
Yep. So that's how the budget works. Now, there are various ways that they can kill a bill. One is the committee chair could just decide not to docket the bill. The speaker could decide just not to assign the bill to committee, which has happened before. They could also decide to send the bill to a commission to study, which is, they think it's a kinder way of killing a bill, but it has the same effect of preventing it from becoming a law. Probably the term you'll hear most often is they'll say that they're going to lay the bill on the table or lay gently on the table, which means that they're voting to kill the bill. They can also pass by indefinitely, which I forget the exact distinction between laying on the table and passing by, but it has more or less the same effect.
It has the same practical effect, I think, and I need to double check this if it comes up in one of our bills. I think if the bill is laid on the table, it can be taken back up off the table, and voted on, but I don't know if that has to happen within the same committee meeting or just before crossover. I think it has to be taken up within the same committee meeting by someone who voted to lay it on the table.
Yeah.
See, there are some really arcane rules here that we're all still trying to figure out.
And there's other various things of, all the complex rules that they can use to try to kill a bill. We've seen all number and manner of things used to kill a bill. Now, how do you find out what's happening with all this great legislation and sometimes not so great legislation? Well, I'm going to stop the PowerPoint real quick and show you my screen. I want to show you the Legislative Information System, which is where you can find all things about the bills. Give me a moment to switch modes. So this is LIS, Virginia's Legislative Information System, where you can find information about bills, you can find out when committee meetings are happening, and what bills are getting heard on the floor. So if you want to find information about a particular bill, you can click on this top one that says Bills and Resolutions. And there's a few ways that you can search for a particular bill. You can look it up by the committee that it's assigned to, by subject matter, by member, or if you know the actual bill number, you can look there. And I saw that we had a question. I'm sorry. The question is, if the budget is not that transparent, why aren't there legal precedents to keep that from happening? And it looked like Christy was about to answer the question.
So this is sort of a guess. My guess, because I have not looked up this particular issue in the Virginia Constitution, my guess is that the way that the legislature is direct and the executive branch, the way they are directed to create a budget must not require any kind of voting in public, other than, they do take votes, once the reports come out, they have a public meeting to vote on the recommendations made in the reports. They always accept them. There really isn't any debate. There aren't any questions. The committees hear public testimony on the budget. They first hear public testimony on the governor's introduced budget in even years, or the governor's amendments in odd years like this year, because it's the second year of the biennial budget. And they have a series of public hearings around the state in January before the session starts. Or sometimes, I think they're all in January, where they will hear from members of the public on different issues that those members think should be included in the budget. And so there is this appearance of transparency, because they do have these public hearings, and that's where they take the vote. But unlike with all of the other bills, which are significantly shorter, they're not hearing and they're not hearing testimony and debating the bill and voting all at the same time. They're hearing the testimony in these public meetings that happen both before the session starts, and then they'll continue to have meetings of the Senate Finance and House Appropriations Committee, where they will hear testimony on the various budget amendments throughout the first half of the session. And then, and after, to a certain, well, basically first half of the session. So they do that, and then they debate it, but they just don't debate it in public. So that is what is missing. They hear the public testimony, they vote in public, but the actual conversation and debate, that's what they're not doing in public. And I don't know, my guess is the Constitution doesn't say a darn thing about that for any of the bills. So that's my explanation.
Yeah. So I know, shake my head, right? So to see where a bill is, I'm going to go ahead and type an example because some of the bill numbers have dropped. And it is very particular about how you type in the numbers. So I'm going to look up House Bill 1652, and it pulls up the bill for me. And it has some pretty key pieces of information. It shows you who the bill is introduced by. It gives you a summary of the bill. And you can also click on a PDF to see the actual text of the bill. When looking at the text of the bill, it'll have, the statute that it's amending. Any additional language will be in italics, and any language that they are getting rid of will be crossed through. And it will show you the history of the bill. Right now, this bill's only been filed. There's no action on it yet. When the legislative session starts on Wednesday, they'll start assigning bills to the committees. So it'll eventually tell you which committee it's going to. It'll tell you when the bill got heard. They'll post any amendments to the bill, and they'll show you the vote counts on the bill. So to follow what exactly is happening with the bill, here's how you look it up. And some other cool things on the LAS website. Well, I'm sorry, let me go back to it real quick. You can also find out who is in the various committees. So if there's a piece of legislation you support and you want to urge the committees to vote for it, you can go pull up the committee page, click on the committee you're looking for, and it tells you all the members who are in that committee. And you can click on their name and it gives you their email address and their phone number, so you know how to contact everyone. It's definitely a website worth checking out to see all the information it has. It has what the daily floor calendars are. You can find meeting schedules of what's happening that day, so when the various committee meetings are being held. And on the bottom of this page here, you can click on those links to watch videos, live streams of the various committee meetings. So for example, look, there is a Manufacturing Development Commission meeting today, tomorrow. So you can watch live, or you can watch recordings after the fact. The Senate stream looks a little bit different, but has the same function that you can watch upcoming meetings or watch any archive committee meetings. Let me turn back to the PowerPoint real quick. Okay. And I can send a really helpful guide to everyone who joined the webinar, so that you have links to where you can find all of this information, such as where to find the live stream, the links for looking up bills, all of that good stuff. So how do you give public testimony in committee? Well, the best way is to show up to a committee meeting in person And as that committee debates the bills, generally they will invite people to speak in favor and against a bill. They usually try to limit the time. But it is entirely up to the chair of the committee whether or not they're going to accept public testimony. In the past, they have accepted virtual testimony, and there's a way for both House and Senate committees for you to be able to sign up virtually to testify via Zoom. We don't know yet if that's going to be available this year. So we have instructions.
Yeah, I will say I just now, as I texted one of my sources, one of my Senate chiefs of staff. I have not heard back from him, but we should know hopefully by tomorrow if they know whether or not they'll be taking virtual testimony in the Senate. I'm not sure I would hold my breath for virtual testimony in the House, but maybe I will be proven wrong on that one.
Right. Even if they aren't offering virtual testimony in the House, and of course it's difficult for people to come down to Richmond in person to testify in committee, particularly when the meeting times can be a bit unpredictable. You don't know when exactly during a 3-hour time span the bill is going to get heard. You can always submit written comments by emailing members of the committee. It's especially helpful if your delegate or senator is on the committee where that bill is getting heard. Believe it or not, state representatives do like to hear from their constituents, and you giving them a phone call or an email to express your support can in fact make a difference on a bill, particularly if it's something that's not very controversial, or they're on the fence about it. Hearing from one of their constituents saying that they support a bill could actually change their vote on how they're going to decide to vote on that bill. So it's important to reach out to your delegates and your senator to show your support for something that you care about. And so if you do get the opportunity to testify in support of a bill, here's some general tips. As Christy mentioned, just because you either sign up virtually or you appear in person, it's not a guarantee that you're going to have an opportunity to speak. But from my experience, for the most part, committee chairs try to make at least some time to hear from the general public, to hear their comment on the bill that they're considering. Now, if they're running on a tight schedule, they might limit the time for public testimony and only allow you to say whether you support or oppose a bill. So just be aware of that. Now, if you are able to do virtual testimony, if that's an option, generally you'll be in a waiting room and they won't be able to hear or see you until it's time for virtual testimony, at which point the clerk of that committee will call your name. And they'll ask you to unmute, and you can say what you feel about the bill. When speaking to a committee, make sure that you state your name and who you're affiliated with. If you're not affiliated with the group, just say, I'm from Fair. My name is Laura Dobbs. I'm from Richmond, Virginia, and I support the bill. And then give a few reasons why you support the bill. Make sure you're really polite and concise, and that you address the chairperson and the other delegates of that committee.
So I have heard back, and this is the chief of staff for the senator who chairs the General Laws Committee, where all the housing bills go. And he says he's 99% certain that the Senate will be taking virtual testimony. So that's good news. We can't hold him to that because he didn't say 100%, but that sounds like a pretty confident statement. And the housing bill should all be heard on the 18th, he says in this text, which is wonderful because that's our tenant day of action. That's next Wednesday, a week from Wednesday.
That's great. So, what type of tenant issues are you going to see at the legislature this year? We have a pretty ambitious agenda. I think everyone knows how hard people have been hit when it comes to housing, between affordability, the eviction crisis, and various habitability issues. So I'm going to share a few things from each of these buckets. The first, focusing on housing affordability. One of the biggest initiatives we have this year is on rent stabilization. And this is a bill that will allow localities to enact rent stabilization ordinances. And what that means is it would prohibit landlords from increasing the rent, year after year, greater than the consumer price index. Essentially, it's a very modest cap on rent increases that ties it more closely with inflation. That way, landlords can't just raise the rent, 200% over what the rent was the previous year. It's a very modest way of trying to keep rent prices in control. It's also not a statewide mandate. It's simply giving localities to choose that option if they want to. There's going to be both the House and a Senate version of that bill, and we will definitely send out an action alert when that bill is getting heard in committee, so that you know to reach out to your delegate and your senator and have some information about how to sign up to testify in support of the bill. This is one of the bills that we anticipate pretty strong opposition from the landlord lobby group. They really don't like this bill, so if we can get as many people as possible speaking up in support and why this is such a strong need, that would be really helpful. The second bill under housing affordability is the Virginia Housing Stability Fund. This would establish a statewide voucher program that would provide long-term rental assistance to families. And the way this would work is, a tenant would only be responsible for paying 30% of their income towards the rent, and the voucher would cover the rest of the rental amount. And this would be for lower income families. This would be a pretty big deal in much of Virginia, but especially for low income families. Northern Virginia has been particularly hit, same with Richmond and Hampton Roads. And the federal voucher program just doesn't provide enough assistance for everyone who needs it. Another goal of this would to be more accessible than the federal program. The federal program has a lot of eligibility requirements that we're hoping to avoid in the state program so that we can help more people. And this is one of those that is a budget amendment, so it gets to go through that special process that Chrissy and I talked about. And the last under this bucket is security deposit reform. Currently, landlords can charge up to 2 months' rent as a security deposit that the tenant has to pay upfront in order to rent the unit. And this bill would cap that deposit at 1 month's rent. That way, a person trying to rent at home would only have to pay 1 month's rent and security deposit plus first month's rent. And it does a few other reforms that way, when you move out of the unit, you can try to get your security deposit back quicker than what's currently allowed, which would give people more cash when they're moving to their next apartment. And that is just a Senate bill. And then under the bucket of housing stability, of making a place that people can stay in, first is expanding the amount of money that goes to the Virginia Eviction Reduction Program. This is a program that already exists. It gives money to localities to implement various eviction prevention programs. Oftentimes it takes in the form of emergency rental assistance, or it could hire more legal aid attorneys to represent tenants in eviction. It could also be used to hire housing counselors. It's pretty flexible, allowing localities to address the eviction crisis in a way that makes sense. Currently, the funding is only $3.3 million per year. In this budget amendment, it would increase that to $9.3 million per year. There was a question that said, are these housing bills that have been proposed in the current 2023 session? Yes, these are all bills that have already been filed, and budget amendment proposals that have already been sent in. So yes, these are all stuff that will be considered this year. And the last one that I'm putting under, the second one under this bucket is one that would, for tenants who are only behind on 1 month's rent, larger landlords would be required to offer those tenants a payment plan before suing them for an eviction. This is not going to help people who owe more than 1 month's rent, but for those tenants who are just a little bit behind and need that extra time to catch up, this could really make a difference, and prevent them from facing an eviction. And this is a House bill. And lastly, in this category, is a bill that's returning from last year. It's something that was in place during the COVID-19 pandemic as a tenant protection. And this is one that would give tenants more time to catch up on rent by extending the pay or quit period from 5 to 14 days. Currently, if a tenant is behind on rent, the landlord has to give the tenant a written notice that says how much they owe, and it has to give them 5 days to pay that rent plus any late fees before the landlord can file for an eviction. This bill would simply extend that to 14 days, giving that tenant more time to get the money together before they end up in court for an eviction. And for those who are just waiting on that next paycheck in order to get caught up on rent, that extra time makes a real meaningful difference. Like I said, this is a bill that we had last year that failed. So we're hoping that we can get it through again this year. We have both a House and a Senate version of the bill this time. And our last general bucket is on housing habitability. We have yet another bill that we had last year. This would allow localities to enforce the health and safety provisions of the Landlord-Tenant Act. In the Landlord-Tenant Act, there's various requirements for the landlord to make sure that the home is safe and habitable. And there are remedies for tenants to take if that's not the case. But those rights are pretty limited. And if a tenant is behind on rent, it can be really hard to force your landlord to make the repairs, because you cannot sue them in court until you pay your rent and into the court, basically catching up on rent before you can force a landlord to do those repairs. This gives localities tools so that they themselves can bring an enforcement action against the landlord on behalf of the tenants. This is something that passed both the House and Senate with bipartisan support, but then the governor vetoed. So we're trying again this year. Hopefully we can make it just as far. I will say though, because the governor vetoed this, we don't anticipate that members of his party are going to be supportive of this bill, even if they voted for it last year. Just one of the obstacles we're going to have to navigate. And lastly is a remedy that, if you go to move into a house and you find that it's in complete disrepair, it's not a safe place to live, this is a process to let you back out of that lease without having to pay huge amounts of money to the landlord. So this is a remedy if it's not habitable at move-in, clarifies that process to get your money refunded to you so you can take that and move elsewhere. And we just have a House version of this bill. I know we covered a lot, and we do have a lot of housing bills this year. That's just a sampling of them. If you're interested in following along on what's happening with tenants' rights bills this year, there's a few ways you can do that. One, you can visit VPLC's webpage at vplc.org/legislative-advocacy, where we'll put information about all these bills, provide updates as legislation moves along. Or you can join us We're going to be meeting every Tuesday evening at 7:30 p.m. to talk about what bills are going to be heard in upcoming committee meetings, coordinate on strategies for testifying in committee, and just give general updates about what's happening.
And those will all be virtual meetings also.
Yes. Yes. Let me see if there's any questions that I missed. The question is, will VPLC track good and bad housing bills? And if so, will we be alerted when actions are anticipated so we can urge senators and delegates to take appropriate action? The answer to that is yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so not only will we have regular meetings to talk about bills that are upcoming, when we expect them to be heard, if we think a bill is in jeopardy, but we will also email out action alerts to folks. There should be a sign up page on VPLC's website so you can get alerts. You can also follow us on social media to get alerts when bills are being heard, and it will include links on how to contact your legislatures. There's a question if there is any mobile home park bills, and I'll let Christy answer that.
Yes, thank you for asking that question. We do have a mobile home park bill. I was just working on the talking points for that earlier today. And it is another step in our efforts to make it easier for nonprofit housing providers and groups of residents to purchase these parks when they go up for sale. And what this bill does is provide a tax incentive for the seller of the park, so that if that seller sells the park to a nonprofit housing provider who agrees to maintain it as a mobile home park for at least 30 years, or to a group of residents that represent at least 25% of the total number of residents in that mobile home park, then that seller can get a tax benefit. And nowadays, I think most of them are having this experience. They make money off the sale of the mobile home park. Then normally that whatever that money is would be counted in their taxable income for that year. And under this bill, if they were to sell it to a nonprofit houser or a group of residents, that whatever that amount of money is that they got from that sale would not count as part of their taxable income. So it would be tax exempt, which I hope, I think it will, I have a pretty good feeling about it. I don't see why people would object to that because it benefits everybody. It's not mandating anything. And I'm hopeful that it will help. Well, we know that there have been a lot of unfortunate sales of mobile home parks to investors that have either led to the redevelopment of the park into apartments and therefore the displacement of the people living there, or have, while they've been maintained as mobile home parks, really lost their affordability because of increased fees for all sorts of things, including significant increases in lot fees. So we have, as I see Mary Payton is on here. Mary and others know that we, along with Delegate Krizik and Senator Hashmi, have been working hard to get legislation passed that will help, as I said, these nonprofit housers and residents purchase the parks. They're not working as well as we had hoped. So hopefully this will pass and it will be helpful.
Yeah. There is also a question, can we receive an electronic copy of this briefing? Yes, I can email out a copy of the PowerPoint, as well as our full legislative agenda and a legislative guide that has all of those links I mentioned. And then there's a question, is there any bill to provide a longer vacate notice for month-to-month renters and buy right properties undergoing demolition, renovation, or conversion?
So that's a great question. And for those of you who aren't as familiar with that statute, the statute requires 120-day notice when there's going to be a change of use to whatever the property is. But it does not apply to month tenancies. And so if you have a community where everybody is month to month, you just have to give them 30 days notice and you can kick everybody out. And that is not a good policy. I have not yet seen any legislation to address that. Doesn't mean it won't come. It just means that we haven't worked on that legislation thus far. But it might still drop. Somebody else may have put it in. And if it's something that's important to the tenant community, then we will certainly try to help advocate for it.
If you have any other questions that come up, please feel free to reach out to Christy or myself via email. And I will be sending out materials, probably not tonight, won't be until tomorrow, so I could actually get some sleep tonight. And we will be putting a recording of the presentation up on our YouTube channel. Thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope you all have a great night, and I appreciate you joining us, and I hope to see you all advocating for tenants' rights issues at the legislature. Thanks.